My name is Martin Coleman, and at 64, I watched my own son raise his hand to vote me out of the company I built with my bare hands. I walked into that boardroom on a Tuesday morning in October, thinking it was a routine review. Coffee in hand, the same agenda format I'd seen 300 times. I didn't know my children had spent the previous 6 weeks preparing something else entirely. I didn't know the chairs had been counted. I didn't know the vote had already been drafted, printed, and stapled into folders before I arrived. My family smiled at me across that table, and before 9 o'clock, they would call me a relic, politely, professionally, with a PowerPoint. But there was one line in the company's charter that none of them had ever bothered to read. Before we go any further, take a second to like and subscribe. It genuinely helps. And drop a comment right now. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now let me take you back to that Tuesday morning in October, the day everything changed. Cedar Falls sits in the flat middle of Ohio, the kind of town where everyone knows your truck and your trouble. The morning was cold and still, the kind of October that smells like sawdust and coming frost. I turned off Route 9 into the yard just as the sun broke above the storage sheds, and I did what I had done almost every weekday for 30 years. I parked in the spot closest to the main doors, the one nobody ever took because everyone knew it was mine. The yard was already alive, forklifts threading between lumber stacks, a driver backing a flatbed toward the loading dock. Pete Harmon waved from the cage office. Pete, who'd been pulling inventory since the Clinton years. I waved back. I built this from a leaking warehouse and a second mortgage. Every nail in this place remembers me. I pushed through the main entrance and took the stairs to the second floor. The conference room was visible through the glass wall at the end of the hall, and I slowed without meaning to. The table held more chairs than usual, not by 1 or 2, by 8. Folding chairs lined the back wall. I counted them the way you count something you don't want to count. There were faces I didn't recognize seated near the window. 2 men in pressed shirts reviewing documents. A young woman with a leather portfolio open across her knees. Not vendors, not contractors. Lawyers, maybe. Or something else. I stood in the hallway for a moment, coffee going cold in my hand, and told myself it was probably the annual insurance review. It was probably nothing. But the folders on the table were already pre-printed, and through the glass, my daughter Karen was pointing at something on a slide she'd clearly rehearsed. Something about that morning felt like standing on ice, solid underfoot, but thin. I stepped into the conference room at 8:45, 15 minutes early, the same as always. Daniel was at the head of the table arranging folders. He looked up when I came in and something crossed his face. Surprise, or something that wanted to be surprise. And then he smiled. Morning, Dad. Grab a seat. We're almost set up. Not, let me show you the agenda. Not, we need to talk before this starts. Just, grab a seat. I pulled out the chair to his left, my usual place. He didn't stop me. He also didn't hand me a folder. Karen came in from the side door with Tom Reyes. I knew Tom slightly. A fund manager out of Columbus who'd been circling the company for 2 years. She was mid-sentence when she saw me, finished the sentence to Tom, then turned. Dad, good, you're here. Today's mostly a listening session for the ownership side. We just need you present. A listening session. For the ownership side. I was the ownership side. I set my coffee on the table. Is there an agenda I should have? Karen glanced at Daniel. A half second, nothing more. It'll all make sense as we go. I almost let it go. 30 years of being reasonable had made the motion almost automatic. But then a young man I didn't recognize leaned past me to place a folder at my seat, and he said, very pleasantly, "There you go, Mr. Coleman Sr." Mr. Coleman Sr. I opened the folder. The first page was a cover sheet. Annual board meeting, October 14th. The third page was a pre-printed ballot, a vote on proposed changes to board composition, already formatted, already numbered. The meeting hadn't started. The vote was already written. I looked at my son. He was reading his own copy. He didn't look up. Let me back up 2 years, because you need to understand how I got to that chair at the foot of my own table. When my wife, Lynn, died, 2014, cardiac arrest. A Tuesday not unlike this one. I kept running Coleman Hearth alone. The children were grown. Daniel had been in the business since his mid-20s, earnest and fast-talking and hungry in ways that reminded me of Lynn. Karen joined the finance side later, sharper in some ways, quieter about what she wanted. I trusted them both. That's not a character flaw. It was a reasonable conclusion based on 30 years of evidence. 2 years ago, I made a decision I thought was wisdom. I stepped back from daily operations. Daniel took the CEO title. Karen took CFO. I kept the chairman role and came in 3 days a week. I told myself this was succession planning done right. I told myself I was preparing them. What I didn't notice, or didn't want to notice, was the gradual quiet, the meetings I wasn't invited to, the strategy calls that wrapped up before I arrived. My old corner office, the one with a view of the yard, quietly reclassified as a collaboration space. During a renovation I wasn't consulted on. Doors don't close all at once. They drift shut inch by inch, until one day you're standing on the outside wondering when it happened. There was one conversation that stayed with me, though I hadn't placed its full weight until that morning with the pre-printed ballot. About 14 months earlier, I'd sat with Walter Briggs, our corporate attorney, who'd been with us since the beginning, to review some routine filings. He'd set a leather-bound copy of the original company charter on the table between us and said, almost to himself, "This document still has some real teeth, Martin. I hope the kids have read it." I'd laughed and said they were smart kids. Walter had not laughed back. Here's what Coleman Hearth Supply actually was, in the language that mattered. 211 employees, most of them Cedar Falls people, third-generation locals, single parents working the yard, kids just out of vocational school who needed a first real job. We were the second largest private employer in the county. When the mill closed in 2008 and a dozen other businesses followed, we were one of the things that held the town together. People bought homes here partly because the yard was hiring. I knew their names. I knew which ones had sick kids, which ones were finishing night school, which ones had stayed after a storm to help without being asked. That wasn't sentiment. That was the actual operating culture of the company. You cannot run a supply business on impersonal systems alone. At a certain scale, it still runs on trust. There was also the matter of the house. In 2009, during the worst of the credit freeze, Coleman Hearth nearly went under. We had a supplier calling a debt early, a bank reducing our line of credit, and a winter order season that came in 20% below projection. I made a decision that autumn that I have never regretted and never advertised. I refinanced the house Lynn and I had paid off together and injected the capital personally. The company survived. The job survived. I didn't tell the children until years later. By then it seemed like old news. Joyce Hale, who had been my first full-time hire back in 1997, caught me in the hallway that morning before the meeting. She was watching the unfamiliar faces in the conference room with an expression I recognized, the look of someone who knows a thing is wrong but can't yet name it. She put her hand on my arm and said quietly, "This town would be half empty without what you built, Martin." I thanked her. I meant it. I went back to my folder with the pre-printed ballot and sat down. The meeting was called to order at 9 sharp. While Daniel arranged his materials at the head of the table, I looked around the room the way you learn to look after 3 decades of running something. Not at faces, but at patterns. Tom Reyes was seated to Karen's right, not at the visitor's end of the table. That placement meant he was expected to participate, not observe. His portfolio was open to a tabbed page. He'd done this before, walked into a meeting already knowing the outcome. I had seen Karen and Tom together 3 times in the past 4 months. Once at the regional banking conference in Columbus, I'd been there too. Caught them at the far end of a cocktail hour, heads together, not noticing me. Once when Karen mentioned casually over the phone that she'd had lunch with a few investors. Once when I found a printed deck in the photocopier tray, face down, and the company name on the header wasn't Coleman Hearth. It was a name I didn't recognize, followed by Acquisition Prospectus, Draft 3. I'd put it back face down and told myself I'd ask Karen about it later. I never asked. That's one of the things I would do differently. That morning, as Daniel clicked his laptop open and the projector warmed up, he caught my eye once. He looked away first. He had looked away first at every meeting for the past 6 weeks. I had cataloged this without consciously deciding to, the way you register whether changes you haven't yet named. There was a slide already on the screen when the projector image sharpened. It read, Coleman Hearth Supply, Strategic Leadership Review. Not the title I'd been given when Karen called to remind me about the meeting. She'd called it the Annual Performance Overview. Why was there already a vote printed before anyone had spoken? 2 weeks before that meeting, Walter Briggs had called me. Not an email, a call. Walter communicated by email unless something required the particular weight that a voice carries. I was in the yard when he rang, walking the new storage expansion with our site manager. I stepped away from the noise and answered. Martin. His voice was even, careful. Walter had been careful for 41 years of corporate law. I've been reviewing some of the recent shareholder filings, board composition changes, signatory updates, routine review. Everything in order? A pause. Structurally, yes. All correct. Another pause, the kind that has a sentence behind it. Have you read the original bylaws recently? Not the amended sections, the original charter from '96. I know what's in it, Walter. I don't doubt that. My question is whether the children have read it, specifically the Class A share provisions. I leaned against the site fence. Below me, a forklift stacked treated lumber with a sound like a slow exhale. Why would that matter? Loyalty is lovely, Walter said, but paper outlives feelings. That's all I'll say. He said goodnight and hung up. I stood there a moment with the phone in my hand, watching the forklift work. I'd structured the company's original charter with Walter in 1996, when Lynn was still alive, and the accountant we used was a man named Bert Simmons, who worked out of his house 2 towns over. We had gone through 3 drafts. Walter had been particular about one section, particular in a way that had seemed excessive at the time, the way a good attorney's caution always seems excessive until it isn't. I thought about calling him back. I didn't. 2 weeks later, sitting in that conference room with the pre-printed ballot in my hands, I heard his voice again. Paper outlives feelings. I kept my face still. I read the ballot again, and I began for the first time to think clearly. By 9:15, everyone was seated. I counted 11 people in the room, 5 board members besides myself, including Daniel and Karen, Tom Reyes and one of his associates, Walter, who had said nothing to me since arriving, and had chosen a seat along the side wall, slightly apart from the main table, the position of a witness, not a participant. Joyce had not been invited. She was at her desk downstairs. 2 unfamiliar lawyers, and me. I was at the foot of the table. In 30 years of running Coleman Hearth, I had never sat at the foot of that table. I had not consciously processed this until I was already seated and looking the length of the room at my son, who sat at the head with his hands folded and his expression arranged into something he probably practiced. Daniel picked up the small wooden gavel. Lynn had used it to call the very first board meeting in 1997, and I'd kept it on the credenza ever since, and struck it once against the block. The sound traveled the length of the room. I'm calling the annual board meeting of Coleman Hearth and Supply to order, he said. His voice was steady. I gave him that. Before we begin the formal agenda, I want to acknowledge everyone here and thank them for making time. He looked at me when he said it. A brief, courteous nod, the kind you give to someone you've already decided something about. The first item today concerns leadership. The projector changed slides. The new title read, Proposed Changes to Executive and Board Structure, for vote. I set the ballot down in front of me. I did not pick up a pen. Across the room, Walter Briggs had his hands flat on the table and his eyes on the screen. He wasn't reading the slide. He was watching me. My son cleared his throat, and it began. The presentation was clean. I'll give them that. Karen had built it over weeks. I could tell by the level of polish, the source charts, the footnoted projections. She walked through it in the measured cadence of someone who has rehearsed neutrality, the company's 5-year performance, market share comparisons to regional competitors, a column labeled growth trajectory that showed a line climbing steeply upward, contingent on a restructuring. The restructuring involved 2 things, a capital injection from Reyes Capital Partners, Tom Reyes' fund, in exchange for a 40% stake, and a leadership modernization that would streamline executive decision-making. Karen advanced to the next slide. It was a timeline. The left side was labeled Legacy Operations. The right side was labeled Strategic Phase. The transition point between them was marked with today's date. I looked at the performance charts more carefully. They were accurate. The numbers were real company numbers. I recognized them. But the framing was selective in one particular and deliberate way. The years that showed the flattest growth were the years after Lynn died, when I'd run the company alone through 2 difficult market cycles and kept every single job intact. Those years were presented without context. They were simply flat lines. The years I had refinanced my house to save the company, those weren't on the chart at all. The omission was too clean to be accidental. Tom Reyes nodded at something Karen said. His associate made a note. The two unfamiliar lawyers had been reading the same page since the meeting started and hadn't looked up once. Daniel sat at the head of the table with the quiet confidence of a man who believes the hard part is already done. He had not asked me a single question. None of them had. The slide changed again. This one had my name on it. The slide read, Chairman Emeritus, a tribute to founding leadership. Emeritus, the word universities use when they want a professor to stop showing up. Daniel stood. He had prepared remarks. I could tell because he glanced down once at a note card he kept flat on the table, then looked up and spoke without looking at it again. He talked about the company's history, about what I had built, about Lynn. He was measured and warm in the way eulogies are warm, and somewhere in the middle of it, I understood that this was, in fact, a kind of funeral. He used the word legacy 4 times. Then Karen took over. She was less sentimental and more precise, which had always been her nature. She outlined the case for transition with the efficiency of someone presenting to a board she expected to agree with. The market didn't reward nostalgia. Institutional investors required demonstrable governance clarity. The company's next phase needed executives with contemporary operational fluency. Her phrase, delivered without a flicker. She looked at me once during this portion. Her expression was composed and not unkind. Dad? No one's erasing you, she said. We're just letting you rest. The market doesn't wait for sentiment. The room was quiet. I had been spoken to the way you speak to someone whose opinion you have already decided not to need. Not cruelly. That's the part that is hardest to explain to people who haven't experienced it. The dismissal was dressed in care. The erasure came gift-wrapped. I looked at my hands on the table. My wedding ring. The ring Lynn gave me the year we paid off the first loan. The hands that had signed the original lease on this building in 1996 when the ink was still wet and the bank was still nervous. The slide was still on the screen. Chairman Emeritus. I did not look away from it. I raised my hand. It was a small gesture, the motion you make at a table where you expect to be recognized. For 30 years, that hand going up had meant the room quieted and waited. Old habits are deep grooves. Daniel saw it. He hesitated 1 beat too long. Then, Dad, we'll have time for questions after. This isn't a question. I kept my voice level. I want to respond to the performance framing in that chart. Another pause. Longer. Karen's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. A door closing. We've accounted for all the relevant periods, Daniel said. The data speaks for itself. The data from 2015 to 2018 is missing context, I said. That was the post-consolidation period after the mill closure. Every competitor in this region contracted. We didn't. We held the workforce and picked up 3 long-term municipal contracts. That's not a flat line. That's a defense. I kept my eyes on the room, not just on Daniel. If you're going to use my years to argue for replacing me, at least use all of them. A beat of silence. Then, from somewhere toward the back, one of Tom Reyes's people, I never determined which, a short, barely audible sound. Not quite a laugh, more like amusement that didn't fully decide to hide itself. It lasted less than a second. Daniel said gently, "We've heard the history, Mom." And he moved to advance the slide. That small sound. I will remember it for the rest of my life. Not because it was cruel, but because of what it revealed. They had already decided. They had decided before I walked in. The presentation, the prepared remarks, the ballot printed and folded into folders before 9 a.m. This was not a conversation. This was a formality. Let me step outside the story for just a moment. Maybe you've felt something like that before. The moment when the people you gave everything to look right through you. And they do it pleasantly, like your objection is a minor weather event. That small laugh in a room full of people who were supposed to know better. If this story is touching something in you, please hit the like button. It tells me you're still here. And subscribe if you haven't. I don't want you to miss what happens next. Stay close, because what they hadn't read was about to become the most important thing in that building. Now, back to that Tuesday morning. Daniel moved through the remaining procedural slides quickly. The way you move through a formality you want behind you. Then he set down his clicker and picked up the gavel. We'll now move to the formal vote, he said. The motion before the board to transition Martin Coleman to the role of Chairman Emeritus, removing him from all active executive and operational positions, effective immediately. This includes board voting rights attached to the current chair position. He read it from the ballot, word for word. All in favor. His own hand went up first. Then the board member to his left, Gerald Fitch, who had been appointed 2 years ago on Daniel's recommendation, and who had, I noted, never once sought my input on anything of substance. Then the member to his right, then the one across from Karen, then Karen. 5 hands. The entire board minus me, because I was no longer being counted as part of it. The room held a particular quality of silence, the silence of people who have been told something is decided and are waiting to see if it will hold. Tom Reyes looked at the table. His associate made another note. One of the lawyers recapped a pen. I looked at my ballot. I had not touched the pen beside it. The motion carried. Daniel noted it for the record. The secretary typed. Here's what I felt, and I want to be precise about this. Not rage, not the collapse I might have expected. Something quieter and more clarifying, like the moment after a loud noise when you can suddenly hear everything. I looked at the table, counted the hands, and looked down the room at Walter Briggs. He was already watching me. His face gave nothing away, but he hadn't raised his hand. I took a moment. Not long. 10 seconds perhaps. Enough to do the one thing I needed to do before I stood. I read the full text of the motion that had just carried. To transition Martin Coleman to the role of Chairman Emeritus, removing him from all active executive and operational positions. Effective immediately. This includes board voting rights attached to the current chair position. Board voting rights attached to the current chair position. Not share-based voting rights. Not the Class A provisions in the original charter. The motion, carefully worded as it was, addressed only the board seat. Only the operational title. I read it a second time to be sure. Then I gathered my papers, capped my pen, and set it on top of the folder. I smoothed the front of my blazer. I stood. The room watched. I picked up my coffee cup, still half full, gone cold. I looked at Daniel, then at Karen. You've made your decision, I said. I'll make mine. Good day. I walked to the door. It is a long room. 22 steps from my chair at the foot of the table to the door. I counted them without meaning to. No one spoke. I heard the hum of the projector, the sound of a chair shifting, the particular held-breath quality of a room that expected something different. Daniel said my name when I was almost to the door. His voice had a note in it I hadn't heard before. Not triumphant, not settled, something thinner. I didn't stop. In the hallway, the fluorescent lights were steady and indifferent. I walked past Joyce's desk. She looked up. I shook my head once, very slightly. She watched me go. Behind me, through the conference room glass, I saw Karen's face. She had expected tears. She had prepared for tears. She didn't know what to do with quiet. Walter arrived at my house at 6:30 that evening. He pulled up in his old Buick, the one he'd driven since 2008 and refused to replace on principle, and came to the door with a manila folder under one arm and his briefcase in the other. He had the look of a man who has been waiting all day to say something. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table. He set the folder between us and opened it to a tabbed page, the original Coleman Hearth Charter, the 1996 version, in the slightly yellowed paper of a document that had been filed, stored, and not consulted for a long time. Walk me through what they voted on today, he said. I told him the exact wording of the motion. He nodded slowly. Board voting rights attached to the chair position. That's what they removed. Yes. He turned the charter to the tab section and slid it across to me. Read from there, I read. The section was titled Class A Founders Shares, Governance Rights. It had been drafted at Walter's insistence in 1996, when Lynn and I were building the initial capital structure. At the time, it had seemed like the kind of provision a careful lawyer puts in for extreme contingencies, the legal equivalent of a smoke detector you install and forget about. The provision was specific. The holder of Class A shares retained the right to convene a special shareholder meeting and call a vote on full board composition, independent of any board resolution or executive authority. I had never transferred those shares. I had given Daniel and Karen substantial equity over the years in various classes, but the Class A shares, the founders' shares, I had held. I simply hadn't thought about them because there had never been a reason to. They voted on your chair, Walter said. They never touched your shares. The smoke detector had never gone off before. Now it was going off. I sat with the charter in my hands for a long time. The kitchen was quiet. Through the window, the yard light over the garage cast the same yellow oval it had cast for 20 years. The house Lynn and I had paid off, refinanced, and paid off again. The house that had once been part of the mechanism that kept 200 families employed. If I call a special meeting, I said, I can bring a vote on the full board, correct? And with the Class A voting weight, the numbers are what they are, Martin. You've held those shares since 1996. They carry the governance weight specified in the original structure. A vote called under that provision would be a legitimate shareholder action, fully within the charter. He paused. I wouldn't be here if I wasn't certain. I set the charter down. They're still my children, Walter. I know. Karen is 35. Daniel has 2 kids. I know that too. The clock on the kitchen wall, the same clock that had been there since the kids were small, the one with the slightly uneven tick, moved through a minute. This isn't revenge, I said, mostly to myself. 211 people come to work at that company. They have mortgages and kids and… I stop. Walter said it gently. Ask yourself the right question. Not whether you could act. Whether the company and the people in it are better served with you having no authority, or with you having the authority you've always legally held. I looked at the charter. I thought about the omitted years on Karen's chart, the pre-printed ballot, the motion's careful wording. So careful, so specific, so certain it had gotten everything. I'm not going to destroy my children, I said. I'm going to remind them who I am. Walter closed his briefcase. Good, he said. Now, let me tell you how this works. Joyce called at 8:45 that night. She had been at her desk when I walked out that morning, and she had watched the rest of the meeting from the hallway window. Not intentionally, she said, but the glass wall made it hard not to. After the meeting adjourned, she had stayed late, and 2 things had reached her. The first was Tom Reyes' associate, who had left a printed document at the copier station. Joyce had recognized the company name on the header, the same acquisition prospectus title I'd seen months ago, the one I hadn't followed up on. She had read enough to see the numbers. The second was a conversation she hadn't been meant to hear, between Daniel and one of the lawyers in the stairwell. She told me what she had understood from it, slowly and carefully, the way Joyce always spoke when she knew the weight of what she was carrying. Daniel had leveraged a portion of his personal equity stake, not the company's assets, his own shares, as collateral for a private financing arrangement. The expansion of the Eastern Warehouse District, the one he'd fast-tracked over the past 18 months, had been partly funded through that arrangement. The timeline had slipped. The collateral was under pressure. He needed the Reyes Capital deal to close to restructure the debt. He hadn't come to the board with it. He hadn't come to Karen with it, not fully. He had come to the conclusion that the fastest path forward required removing the one person who might ask the most inconvenient questions. I thanked Joyce and set the phone down. I sat with that for a while. Not rage. I want to be clear about that. Something closer to grief, and underneath it, a cold understanding. They weren't just greedy. They were drowning, and they had tried to use my company as a life raft without telling me the water was rising. Walter and I worked until nearly midnight. The notice of special shareholder meeting under Class A provisions required specific language. Walter had the form language memorized, which told me he had been thinking about this longer than one evening. We drafted the formal notice together at my kitchen table, the charter open between us, Walter reading sections aloud, and me confirming the figures from memory. The meeting would be called for 9 a.m. the following morning. The charter allowed for expedited notice under certain conditions. Walter had identified the applicable condition 3 weeks ago, which was the other thing he had been waiting to tell me. I called 2 people that night. Not many. I didn't need many. The first was Robert Hale, Joyce's brother, who held a small block of common shares he'd bought 20 years ago, when I offered early employees the option. He'd never sold. He picked up on the second ring, listened for 4 minutes, and said, "Tell me where to be." The second call was to my personal accountant to confirm what I already knew about the share structure. He confirmed it. I did not call Daniel or Karen. There was nothing to say the night before that would be more honest than what morning would demonstrate on its own. Walter left at 11:30. I washed the coffee cups and stood at the kitchen sink looking out at the backyard. The frost had come in properly now. The grass was stiff and silver under the yard light. 30 years ago, I had signed a lease on a leaking warehouse and told a bank I knew what I was doing. They hadn't quite believed me. Lynn had. Walter had. The company had. I went to bed and slept without difficulty for the first time in months. I had stopped waiting for something to happen. I had decided to be the thing that happened. At 9 a.m., I would walk back into that room. And this time, I would speak last. I arrived at 8:50 the next morning. Walter was already in the lobby. He had a leather document case under his arm and the expression of a man who has done this before and knows how it resolves. At the front desk, our receptionist, a young woman named Becca, who had been with us for 2 years, looked up and said, "Good morning, Mr. Coleman," with the easy warmth of someone who didn't yet know today was different. "Good morning," I said. "Is the conference room unlocked?" "Should be. Do you need me to?" "No, thank you." We took the stairs. I heard them before I saw them. The sound of Daniel's voice in the hallway, the particular register he used when he was performing composure. He was speaking to Karen. They were both heading toward the conference room with coffee and folders, the ordinary motions of people who believe the difficult part is behind them. Daniel saw me first. He stopped. His coffee cup paused halfway to his mouth. Then Karen looked up, and for a fraction of a second, her composure did something I'd never seen it do in 35 years. It slipped, just for a moment. Then it returned. "Dad?" Daniel's voice was careful. "We weren't expecting—" "I know." I kept my voice even and light. "You didn't need to. I'm not here to be expected. I'm here for a 9 a.m. special shareholder meeting, convened under Section 4, Article C of the original company charter." I nodded toward the conference room. "I believe you know where it is." Tom Reyes had arrived early and was visible through the glass, reviewing documents. He looked up. He watched the hallway. Something shifted in his expression, the watchfulness of a man recalculating. Walter held the door. "Good morning," I said. "I believe we have unfinished business." We took our seats. Walter sat beside me at the center of the table, not the side wall this time. The secretary who had recorded yesterday's minutes was present again, already typing. Robert Hale came in at 1 minute to 9 and sat across from Tom Reyes. Tom looked at him with the polite recognition of someone who has not yet decided what something means. Daniel stood. "I don't understand the basis for this notice. A special meeting requires 60 hours notice under standard bylaws," Walter said. 9 hours notice under Article C, Section 4, which applies when the convening party holds Class A founders' shares, and the trigger condition is an alteration to board composition within the preceding 24 hours. He set a copy of the charter in front of Daniel, another in front of Karen, a third in front of the company's general counsel, who had said nothing yet but was now leaning forward. Yesterday's vote altered board composition. The notice was served at 11:47 last night via certified delivery to all parties of record. Karen was already reading. Walter spoke slowly, the way you speak when you want every word to have the same weight as every other word. He read the Class A provision aloud. The room was quiet in a way that was different from yesterday's quiet. Yesterday had been the silence of foregone conclusion. This was the silence of people recalculating in real time. When he finished, I spoke. "The vote yesterday removed me from the chair position and from the board seat associated with it," I said. "That was a valid board action. What it could not address, is the governance authority carried by the Class A shares I have held since 1996 and never transferred." I paused. "You voted on the seats. You never owned the company." "I did. I always have." The general counsel put down his pen and asked to see the original charter. Daniel stood up. The motion was sudden enough that his chair scraped back against the floor, and the sound of it cut through the room the way sudden sounds do when everyone is very still. "This is—" He stopped. Tried again. "You can't call a meeting to undo a legitimate board vote. That's not how this works." The board vote stands," I said. "I'm not contesting it. The chairman emeritus designation is yours to keep. What I'm convening is a vote on full board composition under Class A shareholder authority. Those are two separate actions. The charter distinguishes between them clearly." The general counsel had the charter open and was reading with the focused attention of someone who realizes they should have read this document considerably earlier. Karen had gone still. Not the composed stillness of yesterday's Karen, something tighter. She had the look of someone running numbers that are not coming out correctly. "You'd really do this to your own children?" Daniel said. His voice had the quality of someone reaching for an argument when the procedural ground has already shifted beneath him. It was the appeal to sentiment when the facts have stopped cooperating. I looked at him for a moment. No, Daniel," I said. "You did this. I'm only reading what was always true." The room held that. Tom Reyes had closed his portfolio. His associate had stopped writing. They were watching the exchange the way professionals watch a situation reclassify itself, with the careful attention of people deciding what it means for them. The general counsel set the charter down. "The provision is valid," he said quietly, to no one in particular. "The Class A governance rights were never extinguished and never transferred. The meeting is properly convened." Karen looked at her brother. Daniel looked at the table. Neither of them looked at me. Tom Reyes spoke for the first time since the meeting opened. He did it quietly, which is how people deliver information they know will land hard. He straightened his portfolio on the table, looked at Karen, then briefly at Daniel, and said, "I need to be direct with you both. Reyes Capital entered this process on the basis of a presented ownership and governance structure. What's in front of us this morning is a material change to that structure, or rather, a clarification that the structure was different from what was represented." Karen's jaw tightened. "This doesn't affect the terms It affects the foundation of the terms," Tom said. He wasn't unkind about it, but he was certain. "We're looking at a situation where a 40% stake acquisition would be entering into a company with an unresolved principal authority question and, apparently, undisclosed governance provisions that were not surfaced in due diligence." He looked at his associate, a brief glance, "We would need to pause the process." "Tom," Daniel's voice cracked slightly on the single syllable. "I'm sorry, Daniel. We need to review what we've been given and reassess." He gathered his materials with the tidy efficiency of someone who has exited difficult rooms before. His associate followed. "I hope the family works through this. I mean that sincerely." He stood, nodded once toward Walter and me, and left. His associate followed. The door closed. The room held 5 people now: Daniel, Karen, the general counsel, Walter, and me. Karen was very still. 40% of a company that had been valued in preparation for this deal, a deal she had architected over months, the deal that was supposed to resolve everything, had just walked out the door. The line she had drawn on that projection chart, the one climbing steeply upward into the future, had just become a question mark. The 5 of us sat in the particular silence of a room where something irrevocable has just happened, and nobody has yet decided how to speak about it. Daniel was still standing. At some point, he sat down. I watched him do it. The careful, deliberate way you lower yourself into a chair when your legs are not fully reliable. He said, "The Eastern Warehouse financing, I need the board to know that." "I know about the loan, Daniel." He stopped. Karen looked at him, then at me. "I know about the personal financing arrangement you used for the Eastern expansion," I said. "The collateral position, the timeline pressure, I've known since last night." The color that left his face when I said it told me more than any document could have. He had been carrying it alone for months, the weight of a man who made a decision he couldn't undo, and built the next 6 decisions on top of it, each one a little more desperate than the last. He hadn't come to me. That was the wound underneath the wound. "Why didn't you come to me?" I asked. He looked at the table. He was 38 years old, and he looked, in that moment, much younger. "I thought I could fix it. I thought the deal—" "I know what you thought." Karen said nothing. She was looking at her brother with an expression I recognized. She had known more of this than she had let on, and she was doing the accounting of what had been withheld and what it had cost. The general counsel had quietly recused himself to a corner of the room and was reading the charter. I looked at my children, my actual children, not the CEO and the CFO, but Daniel, who used to carry lumber samples to school for show and tell, and Karen, who once cried for an hour because she forgot to submit a vendor invoice on time. I was not triumphant. I was their father. The vote was called at 9:47. Under Article C, the Class A shareholder vote on board composition required a motion and a second. Robert Hale seconded. Walter recorded it. I proposed a restructured board, 5 seats, as before. Daniel and Karen would retain their operational roles, CEO and CFO, but under a reconstituted governance structure with defined oversight thresholds. All significant capital transactions above a board-defined limit would require chair review. The chair position would be reinstated with its original authorities. I was reinstating myself, but I was not removing them. That is the part I want to be clear about, because I think it is the part that matters most. I did not take what they had tried to take from me and use it the way they had intended to use power. I took back what was mine and offered them a structure they could still work within, with conditions and with accountability, but a structure nonetheless. Daniel asked if he would keep the CEO title. For now, I said, with oversight. We'll review it in 6 months. Karen said nothing for a long moment. Then, and the Reyes deal? We'll find another path for the financing, one that doesn't require selling 40% of the company to cover a debt you should have brought to the board a year ago. The vote carried. The secretary recorded it. The general counsel said he would file the amended composition with the state registry by end of day. Walter collected the charter and returned it to his case. He caught my eye once and gave a single small nod. The room that had laughed at me, or allowed laughter, was silent now, and the silence was entirely different in character from the silence of the day before. I picked up my coffee cup. It had gone cold again. I was not finished, but the worst of it was over. The weeks that followed were not simple. The Eastern warehouse financing required untangling, a process that took our accountants and Walter's office most of November to fully document. The structure Daniel had used was not fraudulent, which mattered. It was reckless, which also mattered. And it had been kept from people who needed to know. That distinction shaped everything that came after. The company refinanced the personal debt through a secured line against the Eastern properties that belonged to Coleman Hearth, not to Daniel individually. The board approved it with conditions. Daniel's equity distributions would be reduced by a structured percentage over 36 months, which served as both the repayment mechanism and the record of consequence. It was financial, it was binding, and it was documented. Karen's financial authority was restructured. She retained the CFO role, but required co-signature on all external transactions above $50,000 for a period of 2 years. This was not a punishment, I told her at the meeting where we formalized it. It was a governance standard the company should have had in place earlier. She did not agree with me on that point. She made that clear. I'll help you, I told her toward the end of that meeting, when the room had mostly emptied. Both of you. Once. The way back will be earned, not given. Karen was quiet for a moment. Then she gathered her materials and stood. You knew all along, didn't you? She said. It wasn't quite a question. I knew enough, I said. I hoped I was wrong. She left without another word. Not angry, or not only angry. Something more complicated. A woman who is extremely competent, realizing she had made a significant mistake, and beginning the long, quiet work of deciding what to do with that. That process takes longer than a meeting. I knew better than to expect otherwise. Daniel and I didn't speak, not really speak, for 3 weeks after the board meeting. We communicated through the chain of operational necessity, emails, the required approvals, weekly leadership briefings that he attended with the careful professionalism of someone determined not to give ground by showing what he felt. He was good at his job. He had always been good at his job. That had never been the question. The question was whether he understood that being good at something didn't entitle you to take it. Karen was different. Karen had processed the events with the efficiency she applied to everything, and what she arrived at, based on the conversation we eventually had, in late November, in my office rather than the conference room, was a version of anger she had refined into precision. She didn't think I had been wrong to act. She thought the process had been humiliating. You could have called me, she said, before the morning. You could have called me, I said, before the vote. We looked at each other across the desk. Outside the window, the yard was gray and cold, the lumber stacked under tarps for winter. Respect isn't owed because we share blood, I said. It's built. You both forgot that for a while. I didn't. Karen looked out the window. Her jaw worked once, the way it did when she was suppressing something she'd decided not to say. Then, I knew about part of the loan, not all of it. I want you to know I didn't. I believe you, I said. She looked at me. I believe you, I said again. That doesn't change what happened, but I believe you. She nodded, once. She didn't cry. Karen had not cried since she was 12. I had always suspected that was something to be concerned about, but that was a different conversation for a different year. The story traveled the way stories travel in a small town, through the gas station, through the diner on 5th, through the parking lot of the hardware store on a Saturday morning. Not the specifics. The internal mechanics stayed internal, as they should, but the shape of it. People in Cedar Falls knew that something had been attempted at Coleman Hearth, and that it had been handled. They knew because the company was still running, the jobs were intact, and Martin Coleman had been seen pulling into the yard on Monday morning, the same as always. That, in a small town, is the news. I held an all-hands meeting in the first week of November, the full workforce, in the main yard, which was the only space large enough. I stood on the loading dock the way I'd stood at company announcements going back 20 years. I kept it short. The company was stable. The governance structure had been clarified. There would be no sale, no change in operations, no layoffs. The leadership team was intact and working under updated oversight standards. I thanked them for their patience during what I described as an internal reorganization. Someone in the back started clapping. Then most of the yard joined in. I am not a person who is comfortable with that kind of moment. I raised a hand to stop it and probably didn't succeed fully. Joyce was in the front row, and she was not trying to hide anything on her face. 2 of the board members who had voted against me, Gerald Fitch and one other, reached out separately in the following days. Both conversations were brief and awkward in the way these things are. I accepted what they offered without making it harder than it needed to be. The company was what mattered. The people were what mattered. Everything else was procedure. Let me step out of the story one more time. If you've ever been written off, too old, too soft, too attached to the way things were, I hope this reminds you of something. Your value is not theirs to vote on. If this story reached you, please hit like and subscribe. And I want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever had to set a hard boundary with someone you loved? What did it cost you, and was it worth it? More stories like this one are waiting for you in the description below. I'll see you there. Now, let's finish this one. By January, Coleman Hearth had found its new shape. Not a perfect shape. That would be too clean a word for what family businesses look like after something like this. More accurate to say, a functional shape, with better defined edges. Daniel worked hard that winter. He came in early, stayed late, ran the operations with the same quick competence he'd always had, and added to it something new, the habit of asking before deciding. Not always, not perfectly, but the reflex had shifted. He sent me a weekly summary on Monday mornings that went beyond what the oversight agreement required. I read every one. We didn't talk about October for a long time. Neither of us forced it. Karen and I found a professional working rhythm that was civil and occasionally warm, which for Karen is something. She ran the numbers cleanly. The co-signature requirement slowed her down in ways she found irritating. I suspected the irritation was partly because she recognized its legitimacy. I came in 3 days a week. By choice. Not the 3 days of someone being eased out, but the 3 days of someone who has decided what his role is and intends to fill it exactly that way. No more, no less. The chair position had its proper weight again. The decisions that came to my desk came because they were supposed to, not by proximity or courtesy. Walter called in mid-January. "How's the ship?" he asked. "Sailing," I said. "Agreed." A pause. "You know, when you first called to tell me you were letting the children run the operations, I very nearly said something then." "I know," I said. "You should have." He laughed. Walter didn't laugh often. It was a good sound. "I'll keep that in mind for next time," he said. "There won't be a next time," I said. "No," he agreed. There won't. I've thought a lot, in the months since, about what I would have done differently. The easy answer is, read the room earlier. Notice the closed doors sooner. Ask Karen directly about the prospectus I found face down in the copier tray. Have the conversation with Daniel about the Eastern expansion debt before it became the shape of everything that followed. But I've come to a more complicated understanding. The problem wasn't that I missed the signs. The problem was that I had built something, a company, a family culture, a set of relationships, on the assumption that trust was self-sustaining, that if you gave people enough, if you showed them what it looked like to build with integrity, they would carry that forward without prompting. Sometimes that works. Sometimes people grow up and carry it beautifully. And sometimes people get scared. And pressure does to trust what water does to paper, softens it, blurs it, makes it hard to read. My children were not villains. They were two people under financial and professional pressure who made a series of increasingly bad decisions, each one compounding the last, until the only move that felt available was the one that required making me disappear from the table. They were wrong about that. They were wrong about a lot. But I had loved them long enough to remember who they were before October, and I intended to hold space for who they might be after it. I didn't win by being cruel. I won by knowing exactly what I'd built, and refusing to pretend I hadn't. That's the thing about a foundation. It doesn't disappear because someone decides not to look at it. It's still there, holding the weight of everything built on top of it, patient as concrete. 30 years of patience, and one quiet Tuesday morning. It was a Thursday afternoon in March when it happened. The weather had finally broken, the kind of early spring day in Ohio that feels like a promise being kept. Pale sun on cold ground, the first real warmth since November. I had stayed late going through the quarterly projections, and when I came down from the second floor, the building had mostly emptied. I went out through the yard. The lumber stacks had been reorganized for spring inventory. Fresh cut pine and treated posts, the smell of them clean and sharp in the cool air. The forklifts were parked in their grid. The loading dock was quiet. I stopped in front of the main sign. Coleman Hearth and Supply, established 1996. It was the original sign, metal and hand-painted, which I'd insisted on keeping when Daniel proposed replacing it with something more contemporary 3 years ago. I had been firm on that point without entirely explaining why. I heard footsteps behind me. Daniel. He had his jacket on and his keys in his hand, heading for the parking lot. He stopped when he saw me standing there. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The yard was quiet around us, the particular peaceful quiet of a place that has done its work for the day. He walked over, stood beside me, looked at the sign. "Thank you, Dad." He said it quietly, without elaborating, as if he meant several things at once, and trusted me to hear them all. I nodded. I didn't need more than that. We stood there for a moment longer, the two of us, under the sign I had never taken down, in the yard I had never let go. Then he went to his car, and I went to mine, and the drive home was the same drive it had always been. They tried to vote me out of my own story, but some signatures you can't undo. Some men you can't erase.